Good morning, everyone. It's great to see your faces, and I thank you for joining us on this journey. You know, the theme of this week has been deep dives into the FinAccess data sets. And so I'd like to invite you, maybe not so much to dive deeply with me, but perhaps to go on a little bit of a swim. Because I won't have time to present everything that we've heard over these last few days. But for those of you who've been here every day, I'd like to remind you of some of the key impacts or insights that we've heard. And for those of you who maybe weren't able to join every day, I'd like to tease you a bit with the insights we've heard and encourage you to go back and read the presentations, read the papers when they come out, and join us in this conversation. So this morning when I met with the governor and the CS when they were here earlier, they asked me, what did I think? I had the rare honor of sitting in all the sessions for this conference. I told them I felt like I'd gone on a little mini sabbatical, almost back to school, where I got to listen to these deep insights on the research. And so now I feel like I'm giving a book report. And I will not do justice to any of the presentations that we've heard, but what I've done is I've picked a few slides from each presentation, and I'm going to share at least one insight that I had, and I hope you had as well. So some of you were together with us on December 15th, 2021, when we launched the original FinAccess survey, and I was asked to give a presentation. And what I did in my presentation is I basically asked a series of questions. When I read the report, there was so much more I wanted to know. And this conference has been a part of answering those questions. And so the last thing I said in my remarks that day were, what are your questions? And today we've heard from some of the researchers, and congratulations again to those who won the prize for the students. And yeah, stay tuned. So those of you who've been around here in person know that there is a diving board right next to where we've been eating. For those of you joining online, you may not have seen this diving board, but I thought it was an apt picture to use as we think about how we dive deeply into the research that we've heard about this week. And so what I'm going to do is go through the 4 main sessions of the deep dives, and I've just copy and pasted what those papers are. I'm not going to, again, try to do justice to each of those papers. But what I've done, let me tell you this before I show you this, is I've used a yellow arrow to draw your attention to one insight from each slide. So I can't present the whole slide. I'm going to just focus in on where that arrow is pointing. So the first paper, which was from Finnmark Trust, Gimarich, and KNBS, was looking at livelihoods. And they presented many things, but one of the first slides that really caught my attention was this one, which shows that all welfare measures have significantly worsened in 2021. And that gray box shows you kind of a pivot point that they talked about, showing how things had gotten worse. And then they considered what are the economic pillars that are driving declines in jobs and well-being. And they looked at these 4 areas of the composition of GDP, the youth bulge, market access, and government coordination. And I'm, again, just going to tease you with just one of those, which is the youth bulge. And I think we're all aware of how important the growing youth population is and how much more excluded youth are from the general population. And that's a big question that we need to answer as we think about the policy implications of this deep dive work. Moving right along, again, I'm not going to share the full stories, but the reason I included this slide is that it's great to look at all the charts and think about the statistics, but there are real people behind every number. And so it's really important for us to understand the stories that really spell out what those insights from the charts are telling us so that we consider the impacts of finance on real people, including these 2 women who were talked about, Cynthia and Paris. Moving right along to the next paper, we saw some fascinating segmentation work. And here I've just pulled out one of the segments that was highlighted, which is the urban core casual worker. That's 3.3 million people. More male, more young, less educated. But those 2 yellow arrows that you see are showing that there are huge market opportunity, 25 billion shillings, if you take kind of their median income times the number of people. And yet they're using formal financial services at a very, very low level. And so what is the opportunity there to better reach this important segment of Kenyan society? And this graph Lots of numbers, lots of charts here. It shows all 8 of the segments that were presented. And I put the yellow arrow looking at that urban core casual workers. And what you can see is that they are using credit at about 61%, but most of that credit is just to help them get by day to day. It's not about investing in the future, and even in this case, not so much on emergencies. This contrasts with some of the others, which are, for example, public sector employment, private employment, small firms, where they're investing a bit more with that credit. Now I know you all want to go and look at that segmentation. Tabitha from KNBS presented the FinAccess MSE tracker, which was also mentioned in the speeches earlier this morning, about how important it is to take a look at the FinAccess data that we have and say, what's really happening? This tracker happened during COVID. And in November 2020, when they went back and looked at the MSEs who'd been included in the 2019 FinAccess survey to see, you were in business in 2019, are you still? You can see that those in the green circle were no longer in business. Through each round of that tracker, more and more of those businesses fell out, and only a few came back. And so going from 262 in November, which had been 347 in 2019, to only 179, plus the 15 who had reopened their businesses. There's so much more in those trackers. Definitely check them out. So moving speedily along to our second deep dive. To what extent has financial inclusion been fair, inclusive, and value-adding? For those of you who are with us, this is the session that happened yesterday morning, first thing. The first paper that was presented by Mariangela Pensa was really looking at what would exclusion look like if we looked at it from a broader perspective. The numbers that we just saw from the counties is looking at exclusion kind of in pure access terms, but if we were to consider what about the use of those services and whether they're providing value, what she and her team found was that there is a much higher level of exclusion than what FinAccess shows if you look at a more holistic picture. And while exclusion is decreasing, that yellow arrow points to how if you think about more than one product or a diversity of financial inclusion, 34% is still a very high number for those who are not fully using finance the way that it's intended. Moving right along, there was a Financial Consumer Protection Outcomes Index presented by Christine from Sinfree. I personally found this one very interesting. And what they were doing, you can see this kind of spiral. On the left, you've got financial consumer outcomes, and on the right, you've got consumer protection outcomes. And so looking beyond what the regulation or the law says, how are consumers experiencing both consumer protection and their own kind of outcomes? And so if you look at how Kenya did against this, remember we've got 84% financial inclusion, but according to this, only 67% on this index. What I found even more interesting is when you break it down along these different indicators, you can see that the ones that are lowest, those red flags, are around, are financial services meeting the purpose that people have, and do consumers have voice in their interactions with financial service providers? Still quite low on both of those. And if we double click even further and compare different parts of the population, you can see the difference between men and women here. Women are much less likely to have financial services that are meeting their purpose, that have full disclosure, and the lowest is that they don't have the voice that they need to negotiate with financial service providers. A lot of great questions. This is a new index, something to explore, and I think something we can dig deeper into. Moving along to financial health, my colleague Amrik presented the paper that she had and Paul Gubbins had done on financial health. And the reason I've got the yellow arrow pointing at the pink boxes is some of you have heard about financial health, but what this chart is showing is those who have the least financial health has basically mirrored it has increased significantly, mirroring the decline in those who are actually financially healthy. A real point of concern as we think about increasing financial inclusion but lowering financial health. And if you look at this, and there's lots of numbers on here, but the main point I want to make is that the short-term needs have become the predominant use case for savings and credit. It's important to be able to use finance for short-term needs, but we hope that people can use finance for their long-term needs as well. And then how are people meeting these needs? They're meeting them through social network and digital loans and mobile money wallet savings. Speeding right along to the third deep dive along climate, environmental risk, and financial inclusion. The 2021 survey added new questions to look at this issue that is of climate risk. And I think as many of our colleagues are at COP27 this week, I know this is all top of mind because climate risk is happening to Kenya, and the adaptation in particular needs are very high for Kenya. This chart I found these two charts I found very eye-opening, and they're comparing what the population density of Kenya was in 1962 versus 2019. You can see that has significantly increased. And what we see now is that 33% of the population is living in dry lands. And that means that they're climate risk affected populations, and as we know that there's a drought right now, and so that's 33% of the population dealing with that. And that really set the context for looking into climate risk. Camilla and her presented the research that she and her team had done around looking at climate shocks and the incidences and impact of those. There's a lot of information on this slide, but let me just draw your attention to that yellow arrow, where they were looking at are climate-affected populations using solutions to deal with climate risks. And what you can see is that in 2019, it increased significantly how many people were selling assets or livestock to deal with climate risks, which is a sign of stress. They also looked at whether how those in climate-affected populations are dealing with finance differently than non. And that yellow arrow is looking at mobile money, which is showing that those in climate-affected populations have increased their use of mobile money more rapidly than the general population. Perhaps it's more relevant because it's in remote areas where mobile money can reach and traditional finance has had more difficulty. Okay, we're in our final deep dive session. Is Kenya's financial sector serving women? And I had the honor of moderating the panel after this, and I think it's been great that we've heard from all the speakers today the importance of looking at that gender gap. You know, as we think about the policy implications of the gender gap, it's going to be great to be able to dig into that county level data on the gender gap. The first paper that was presented from Kenya Bankers Association, your colleague Kabil, is looking at, again, this county level data and trying to say, what does it mean for women across the different counties? I won't try to do justice to all of these colors, but if you, again, I've got the arrow down here. Dark green are counties that are actually doing better for women versus the light green. And so there may be some counties on there that surprise you in terms of better outcomes for women, even in those counties which sometimes are overall rather low. This is looking at some analysis about the correlation between financial inclusion and different indicators, and I just picked one, which is mobile phone ownership. And what you see is for both men and for women, the owning a mobile phone is highly correlated with financial inclusion. But for women, you can see that curve is much steeper. It is so much more important for women in terms of correlation. And on the flip side, that means that women without a phone are very unlikely to be included. Okay, moving on to almost the last paper. Thanks for sticking with me. And it's really looking at mutuals and the value of mutuals in the financial inclusion landscape in Kenya. And I picked this slide because I thought it was one that surprised me when I was looking at it. It's looking at those in a chama are much more likely to be financially healthy than those who are not. And this is especially true for women. So what is it about being in a chama that is correlated with financial health? Now, we don't know whether it's one that drives the other, of course, but we can look at that prevalence, and I think that it begs some interesting questions. You know, this is a session about deep dives, and I think the next step is probably around deeper dives. If we look at gender, when the team was presenting this, they said they wanted to bust the myth. I think a lot of people, when they think of chamas, they think of women. And there are more women than men using chamas. But in 2021, we still have 20.7% of men using chamas. So let's not kind of stereotype what a chama is. And as I keep going on to bust some myths, I think people also think of chamas as being the lowest income. But what we see is that almost a third of the highest wealth quintile are also using chamas, right? So this is something that is across all segments of the wealth quintiles, education and many other livelihoods as well. One slide I didn't include is that the business owners are the most likely to use chamas and find them a valuable part of their financial portfolio. And this is the last presentation that was presented, and it was from the Alliance for Financial Inclusion. Again, lots of information on there. The reason I've put it up there is because I know that in yesterday's session, or actually it was day 2 session with the financial regulators, and yesterday we also had Communication Authority and Competition Authority. All of them were talking about the importance of adding not only demand side sex disaggregated data, which FinAccess gives us, but also supply side sex disaggregated data, which provides different information than we can get from the demand side and can provide insights about how we can close that gender gap that we heard from KNBS at each county and across different financial service providers. So my yellow arrow here is pointed at do something about it. That's what we want to do. That's what this conference is about. It's not just about listening to interesting things, but thinking about what are the implications of those interesting things for policy and industry change. Thank you for your patience and sticking with me through this presentation. Hopefully it's not been too long, and it's given you a taste of what you've missed if you weren't here. It's reminded you of what you've heard if you were here, and it's invited you on the swim to go deeper into this data and use it for policy. Thank you very much.